Thank you so much. It's great to have a chance to talk with you today about our new project, which we call HiTIDER, in which we're launching a new mapping initiative to use history and topography to improve decision-making for estuary restoration. And this project shows the National Estuarine Research Reserve System in action. We have all 29 of the reserves participating. Those are the red dots on this map, and over 20 other organizations. So it's a big collaboration. And as you probably know, the reserves are partnerships between NOAA and the coastal states. And this particular project is funded by the NERS Science Collaborative. Estuaries are coastal water bodies connected to the sea, and they contain tidal wetlands. And tidal wetlands can be saline, salty, brackish, or fresh. And they include a number of different types of wetlands, but two of the types that are most important to restorationists are tidal marsh and tidal swamp. Here are some photos of tidal marsh on the left, and marsh is dominated by low-growing non-woody species. And then on the right, tidal swamp, dominated by woody plants like shrubs and trees. And these photos are all from Oregon, but here are a couple of examples of forested tidal swamps from the southeastern US as well. So our estuaries have really changed a lot over the past couple of hundred years, and we need to understand these changes in order to manage the resources. And there have been watershed-wide changes like dams and flow alterations, and major changes to sediment inputs, erosion and accretion rates. Global changes like sea level rise and climate change affect entire watersheds and estuaries and the tidal wetlands in them. In terms of on-site changes, of course, tidal wetlands are subject to fill and development. They've often been diked, and tidal flows have been blocked in other ways. Ditches and drainage systems have been installed, trees have been logged off, and vegetation has been otherwise manipulated. And many of these uses lead to soil compaction and a sinking of the land surface called subsidence. Our recent study showed that these kinds of changes have led to the loss of 85% of our tidal wetlands from the West Coast. And yet, this study didn't address how these changes have affected the landscape array of tidal wetlands. That is, what wetland types have been most heavily impacted and where. And this is a really important question. One really basic question we can ask is, how do past wetland losses compare among these three major wetland types of tidal wetlands: emergent, shrub, and forested wetlands? And we've actually answered this question for the coast of Oregon in a recent study. And this map shows an example of the results for one estuary, Tillamook Bay. And here you can see the bay emptying out to the Pacific Ocean. And I'm going to zoom into the southern part of the estuary, where you can see our findings more clearly. What we found was really eye-opening. Over half of our historical tidal wetlands were forested, not tidal marsh, and 92% of those tidal forests have been lost. So these are huge changes and very important to our understanding and management of the estuary. So HiTIDER will address these questions at all 29 of the reserves. How has the estuary extent changed? How has the landscape array of tidal wetland types changed? And where are there restoration opportunities? We develop this kind of information not from existing data sources, because those that exist are not appropriate to our purposes. For instance, the National Wetland Inventory, which is a great resource, isn't intended to answer the question of where wetlands were historically. So for instance, the NWI is really good at identifying tidal marsh. It's visually distinct. But when you get into a highly altered agricultural landscape like this south part of Tillamook Bay, the NWI can't answer our questions about where tidal wetlands were historically. For this, we use elevation data. So shown on the right is a LiDAR digital elevation model, which illustrates the topography and is really, really enlightening for understanding historical conditions. And in order to find those historical tidal wetlands, we use water level datums and spatial models from NOAA, including, for instance, this extreme water level data available at tides and currents. We then combine the LiDAR DEMs with the NOAA data to find areas below the annual high tide level. And this gives us our historical estuary extent. And I encourage you to check out our PLOS One publication to learn more about the method and the limitations of it. But the question remains after doing this kind of elevational analysis, are these areas still tidal wetlands today? And there are several ways to answer this question. One is to go back to that National Wetland Inventory. And within that historical estuary boundary, we need to know whether areas are currently tidal wetlands. And the NWI can give us those current tidal wetland areas. Those are the small blue areas here. There aren't many in this particular area. And all the remaining areas within that historical boundary are not currently tidal wetlands and therefore would be considered areas of tidal wetland loss. And here's an example from a part of the estuary where there are some more current tidal wetlands here. So it gives you a little better sense of what that analysis looks like. But what about that change to wetland diversity? So for this part of our study, we use historical ecology resources like NOAA Coast Survey Charts, or T-sheets shown at the lower left, or data from General Land Office survey records. And those can tell us what the historical wetland type was within this boundary of the historical estuary extent. So you can see that for this area at the south end of Tillamook Bay, it was mostly forested. But today, getting our current wetland type from the NWI, it's mostly emergent, not forested. So in combination, these two types of analysis show us losses due to diking or disconnection, as well as losses due to vegetation conversion. So this is a really powerful set of tools for understanding historical change in our estuaries, and it's what led us to this map I showed you earlier, and this is the area we've been zooming in on. So we use this kind of information for setting priorities for restoration and conservation actions, to find potential restoration sites, and to serve as a baseline for tracking future change, because we now have better, more accurate information about current conditions. And you can get more information on our project from these two websites, and I would be really happy to answer any questions now.